Well, welcome to Christian Answers again for this week. This is Pastor Jeff Short, and today I want to talk about the chaos that is occurring in our nation at this point right now, socially, politically, morally. It's just to the point where a lot of us are getting to the point where we don't even want to turn on the television anymore. We don't want to listen to the news. I usually avoid the network news if as much as I can. I certainly don't run in there and watch it every day faithfully because I know exactly what I'm going to get from the network news. I'm going to get a one-sided, propagandized, manipulated presentation of what's going on in the world. And it's going to follow a very clearly defined narrative that is going away from God, that is an ungodly, sinful, secular, humanistic worldview, and I'm going to only get that perspective. And so why would I want to rush to watch the mainstream media when they are trying to propagandize me? So I just avoid the mainline media's news presentations as much as possible. But it's actually very difficult to do that. Because if you have your radio on in your car, it's the top of the hour, you're going to get hit with headlines that are deceptive, manipulative, and actually lying sometimes in an effort to try to get you to conform to what that mainstream narrative is. And so even radio, even headlines, even newspapers, that is the most, I think, safest source of news today. But even the newspapers, the print, those are manipulative also because of the headlines. You have a particular narrative being spun, and you can't trust the reporters to give you actually what is taking place. For example, they may report that an unarmed black man was shot by police yesterday, okay? But what they'll fail to tell you is that he was reaching for his gun when he was shot. So the narrative is that an unarmed black man was just simply shot by police who are racist, everyone knows, and that's the narrative. So, but actually, when you look into the facts of each news report, you'll find that it's more nuanced and there are actually details that are left off to try to get you to think one type of way. And this is really frustrating for Christians because we're at the point right now in this country where we don't really know if we can trust anything that's being put out by the mainstream media. We certainly cannot trust statistics and data that's being put out by the mainstream media. I have people sometimes quote COVID-19 statistics. They quote CDC statistics. And you want to ask yourself, okay, are they comparing COVID deaths of people that died of COVID or died with COVID? Okay, the big difference. Are they lumping in together all of the statistics that have counted someone with symptoms of COVID as a COVID death, or are they simply strictly counting people who have been tested and have been found with COVID and died of COVID. Again, it's so confusing right now. It's almost chaotic to the point where you really cannot know who you can believe and who you can trust when they're telling you things. There always seems to be this spin and this narrative that's being pushed by the mainstream media. We're being told that, for example, the major cities, the major democratic cities like Los Angeles and New York City and Chicago, we're being told that they have to lock down and they have to have strict rules because we don't want people to die of COVID. Yet, their own statistics show that people in large numbers are not dying of COVID-19. And so what is the purpose of the lockdown? In Los Angeles, for example, it was told, okay, we have to do this to flatten the curve. The curve is flattened, but they still continue to put forth new regulations every day about what people can do, what they can't do. They can't go out here, they can't go here, they can't go here. And there's beginning to get the idea that these blue state mayors and governors are doing things for political purposes rather than health purposes. They're doing things to try to destroy the economy. They're doing things to try to destroy the society, to try to create chaos, to try to foment revolution and discord and all kinds of anarchy in order to then blame the opposite party. It's just to the point where Christians have to sit back and say, what in this world can I actually trust? Well, that's a good thing that Christians are beginning to question, because for a long time we've just simply assumed that our society, of course, this is America, we can trust and we can believe, and the basic decency of the American population and our leaders are basically good and we can trust them. Well, we're learning that when you live in a fallen society, even your beloved nation, and when you live in a society that's rebelling against God, which our country is doing, that you can't simply assume that your nation is the good guy anymore. You can't assume that your people are the good people anymore, because that is a false assumption. The Bible says all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Yes, we've been able to live in a semi-Christian nation, and that was produced by a semi-Christian culture, our Western society, and we have been the beneficiaries of much blessing from God because of that. But in recent years, we have seen how the Judeo-Christian worldview has been pushed aside and actually rejected by the influencers and the elites and the opinion setters and makers of our nation. And that now we really are not living in a Christian worldview nation. We are not living in a semi-Christian nation. We are fast approaching living in a actual hardcore, secular, humanistic, atheistic society that has nothing to do with God and doesn't want anything to do with the Bible or Christianity. And so our values are being thrown down on the ground and trampled underfoot. And we're seeing chaos in the streets. We're seeing riots in cities every single day in our country. This United States of America, we have always assumed that we were a special people, that God has blessed us because we put his principles first. There were so many Christian truths and principles that went into the founding of this nation. Not that it ever was a truly, quote, Christian nation, but it was a semi-Christian nation that had many, many, many biblical principles that went into the making of our country. But now these Christian principles are being systematically disintegrated before our very eyes, and we're seeing what happens when a nation abandons God. And that's what's happening today. We're seeing our nation abandoning God. We just had the Democratic platform, and we actually have a party, to quote a California pastor, John MacArthur, that is actually basing its platform on rebellion against God. It's basing its political statement as an anti-Christian statement. So, babies in the womb, kill them. Don't just kill them, taxpayer-funded killing them. So in other words, you make the Christians pay for non-Christians to kill their babies. That's what the Democrats want. They also want the perversion of marriage. So it's not enough to just promote easy divorce, promote shacking up, living in sin, don't even bother getting married. It's not enough to do that. Now you have to go so far as to actually promote homosexual so-called marriage, the perversion of the basic man-woman equation in marriage. And so the Democrats are now all on board and promoting that. And they want you to accept that. And if you don't accept it, there's something morally wrong with you. So in other words, you take a moral position and you flip it 180 degrees, and then you try to shame the people who are actually the godly, moral people because of their position, while the sexual perverts are taking a high position that they say is a high moral ground. And so you're flipping values totally on end. And that's what the Democratic Party is doing. And we're seeing this happening right before our very eyes. We're seeing our cities in flames. We're seeing murders taking place in the streets. And then the people that do the murders, they just walk free because they're not the right color. And the people today now, if you're white and you shoot someone, you're automatically guilty of first-degree murder, and you will be prosecuted first-degree murder. Throw the book at them. It doesn't matter what the circumstances were. It doesn't matter if someone's shooting at you. If you're a white person and you kill a black person, you are going to get the book thrown at you because you're a racist. And the reason it motivated you is racism. And it's assumed. So in other words, there's no discussion about this. That's the frustrating part as a Christian. We're seeing all of this taking place. And the Church of Jesus Christ is caught right in the middle of it. We're seeing, for example, Pastor John MacArthur out in California. All he wants to do is do what he has done for 50 years in California, and that is on Sunday morning, he wants to go to his church and preach to his people. And he can't do that because the state is telling him, no, you cannot come to the church, and you cannot open the church doors for your people, and you cannot preach to your people because that is illegal according to our health guidelines. And so you will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, and you will be jailed if you don't comply with our wishes. And so they are targeting churches. Again, all this pastor wants to do, like he's done for decades and decades and decades, is open the doors of his church. People come to church, they hear the word of God, they praise God, and they thank God. And yet, the state of California is telling him, here in the United States, telling this pastor, you cannot come to your church on Sunday morning. You cannot open the doors of your church. The people of the church cannot come to this church. You must stay home because we have a rule that you can only have 100 people in a church service or whatever. Or you have this rule, or you have this rule. And so churches are under assault. Now, there are some churches who are trying to flip this all around and say, no, we're not under assault. The government is not attacking us. We're choosing not to meet because we don't want to put anyone at risk. In other words, instead of seeing it as an attack on religious liberty, on freedom of religion, instead of seeing it for what it is, they're living in denial And that's easier for them to live with, to say, hey, we actually are getting attacked and persecuted by our state. I don't think this has ever happened before in the United States, where the government tells churches they can't meet. I don't think this has ever happened in all of our over 200 years history of our country. I don't think it's ever happened. But it's happening today. And there are hundreds and thousands of churches who cannot meet because the government or their state government or their city government or their county government is telling them they cannot do so. And now John MacArthur is saying to his people, we're going to have the church open. It's up to you. We're not forcing you to come here. If you feel that COVID-19 is dangerous enough to die from, and if you catch it, you'll die, and if you think that you might catch it, well, then stay home, watch the service on TV. But for all of you who don't believe that we're being told the right information, for all of you who don't believe the so-called experts as they change their mind all the time as to how severe this illness really is and how severe this epidemic really is, and as the statistics keep changing and as the data keeps changing and the models keep changing, at one point we're supposed to have 2 million people die in this country alone. In New York City, there were all these hospital beds waiting for all the sick people to be plopped into their hospital bed, and it never materialized. And in most instances, I think almost every place in the United States, the curve has been flattened. Hospitals are able to deal with the ones that are very sick. And so we're at the point where we understand enough about COVID-19 that we can go about our normal activities taking basic safety precautions. But no, that's not enough. And we have states and cities telling churches, no, you still can't meet, and we won't let you. And if you try to meet, we're going to fine you thousands of dollars a day and maybe even jail you. Jail the pastor, jail the elders, and anyone who shows up on Sunday morning. And so this is really something that we've never, ever seen in this country before. Never. Even when we have a First Amendment that says we have the freedom of religion, we have religious liberties written into the Constitution, these things are totally being ignored by politicians. And there's no way we can stop it. There's no way that we can appeal. Why? You appeal to a judge, and the judge, against the Constitution, against the religious liberties that we have, rules in favor of the county, or rules in favor of the city, or rules in favor of the state. And so the judges are part of the problem. See, you have these Democratic mayors and governors in the state and local and county levels, and then they appeal to Democratic judges, and these Democratic judges play their part, and you have this cycle of oppression taking place in our country, and the churches are caught right into it. Now, Christians are scratching their heads and saying, okay, well, how do I process all of this? This is something I've never seen before in my whole life. I never thought I would ever see our own country making it difficult for Christians to function and go to worship. In fact, one of the last free places on earth for religious expression was supposed to be the church. As the liberal Democrats, the secular humanistic thinking goes, the public square, the out in public, the visible expression of culture, that was pushing Christianity further and further back out of the public square. And the one place that Christians were supposedly allowed religious freedom and liberty was in the walls of their own church. But now because of the power grab by the blue state liberal mayors and governors and county officials. They're not even allowing Christians to go into their own churches. And Christians are confused, and a lot of believers are confused, and a lot of pastors are confused because they want to, on the one hand, submit themselves to the ruling authority, as Romans 13 teaches us, but on the other hand, they want to obey the commands in the book of Acts where it says we must obey God rather than man. And so when there's a contradiction between what the state is telling you and what God is telling you, you need to follow God supremely, because God is God, not the state, right? Now, if you're in China, communism wants to be your God. And some Christians are actually using the argument, well, we have to be thankful that we're not in China, at least, even though the county or the state or the city officials won't let us go to church. At least we're not in China. At least we're not being hunted down by the communist government. And they think that that is a Christian way to look at things. That is not a Christian way to look at things. No, we're not China, and we don't want to be China, and we don't ever want to get to the point of China. And the way we don't get to the point of China is that we resist the imposition of this secular, humanistic, godless worldview. We resist it, and we say, no, we're going to go ahead and meet in our churches. And if you want to arrest everyone, go ahead and arrest everyone. And we need to just challenge these ungodly authorities head on. And I applaud Pastor John MacArthur. He's the most high-profile pastor in this country to stand up to this oppressive, ungodly regime that we see taking over our country. We need to pray for him and ask God to give their congregation health. You know, the last thing they need is someone to either come into their congregation from the outside, or someone from the congregation gets COVID-19 and it spreads, and then the whole world will laugh at them and say, see, you trust in God and you think God will save you, and he won't save you. The only thing that'll save you is a vaccine that hasn't been invented, and you have to turn to science, you have to believe in the experts, and on and on and on like that. So we need to pray that God will keep his congregation safe, and all congregations. You may be a Christian right now that is meeting in church. I'm a Christian that is meeting for church, and I thank God for the opportunity that we have to meet live and in person. And we've taken it for granted for so many years. All my life, I've always taken it for granted that if I get up on Sunday morning, I can go to church and I can praise and worship God with the other people there. I can hear a sermon preached from the Bible. I can greet people with a greeting, and I can pray with them if need be. I've always assumed that I would be able to go to church on Sunday morning. But today everything is totally turned upside down, and there are still millions and millions of Christians who cannot go to their church on Sunday morning. In fact, there are thousands of pastors who have actually canceled their church services. And they think they're doing the right thing because they think they're following Romans 13, because they think they're supposed to submit to the ruling authorities. But there is a point when submitting to the ruling authority actually becomes disobedience to God, because you are putting man above God. And God says in Hebrews, the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, he says, do not forsake the assembling of yourselves one with another. In other words, don't neglect the church. Don't neglect attending the public gatherings of Christians. Don't do that. And so if God says to not neglect that, we can't neglect that. And if the authorities of our state, authorities of our county or their city tell us we can't go to church, we have to ignore them, just like John MacArthur and his congregation has ignored them. They've looked at the statistics, all of the numbers that people use to justify this and that, and the manipulation of stats and data and figures. They've looked at all of the inconsistent statements by the so-called experts, whether it's at the CDC or whether it's coming from Washington, D.C., or whether it's coming from the World Health Organization, or whether it's coming from these models that were put forth. MacArthur and his church, Grace Community Church out there, have looked at all this, the varying and confusing and chaotic statistics, and concluded, hey, we don't know of one case of anyone going to the hospital from our church with COVID-19. We don't know any people who are dying from it. This is being overhyped. This is being overinflated as far as the danger. And they are simply saying, we are going to do what God tells us to do because we cannot see any sure and safe and reliable information that tells us that we shouldn't. And so they're going ahead with their church. And I believe that that is the correct way to do it. Now, I don't say that every church needs to copy exactly the way John MacArthur and Grace Community Church is going about this, but they need to not allow the secular authorities to usurp the power of God. Because, yes, we're not in China yet, and thank God we aren't, but one of the ways that we keep from being like what they're doing in China is to resist that kind of government. And if we just follow government and do whatever it wants us to do, we will be a China. They will take as much authority as they can get and as much as we give them. And so if we all rebel against these oppressive health regulations, the so-called health regulations, which really are unnecessary, then we can prevent the further abuse of power that these power-hungry Democrats want to exercise. Now, we have to say it. It's the Democrats. Now, a lot of church leaders and pastors want to be on the fence. They want to say, well, you know, the Republicans and the Democrats, it's all politics. You know, I don't want to take any side in anything. And they want to treat both parties as equal as far as the Christian worldview, and they want to treat the whole issue of voting for what party or the other as sort of a neutral thing. And, you know, there are Christians that vote Democrat, there are Christians who vote Republican. No. You can't do that anymore. You could do that 50 years ago. You could do that 60 years ago because the parties differed on basically economic issues and a few other political, questionable, negotiable things. Now it's very clear. If you're an ungodly, anti-Christ person, you're going to be a Democrat. If you have any semblance of Christianity left in you, you're going to be a Republican. The Republicans are the only ones standing with the unborn babies. They're standing against the killing of unborn babies. They're the only ones that put up any resistance against the sexual perversion of gay marriage. They're the only ones that are trying to fight for religious liberty, as the Democrats are trying to assault churches and Christianity. And there is not a neutral place to stand. So if you're a pastor and you're trying to give everyone permission, you can vote Democrat, you can vote Republican, and still be a good Christian. Stop that. It's nonsense. That was the way it was maybe 50, 60 years ago. Today, if you vote for a Democrat and you call yourself a Christian, you should be ashamed of yourself, and you don't understand anything. And there's no justification for that. And pastors need to call it like it is and stop trying to be neutral on these issues, because there is no neutrality anymore. And that doesn't mean the Republicans are all good. There are problems in any of those Republican candidates, but at least they have a semblance of the Christian worldview left, which is rapidly diminishing even among Republicans. Well, I hope that's been a helpful word of caution, and we'll see you back next week on another edition of Christian Answers. God bless.